Hey there, and welcome to another episode of The Bible. Wait, what? Yes, this is the podcast that unravels the mysteries of the Bible's most perplexing, puzzling, and thought-provoking passages. My name is Rohan, and each session I'm joined by a member of our team at C3 Church Camden, Picton and Thirroul as they quiz me on some of the more complicated, confusing, challenging, and even confronting passages that we read in our weekly Bible reading plan. We understand that reading the Bible can be a challenging and perplexing experience. Many people just don't know where to start, they get confused, and so they give up. Well, that's why this podcast exists, to equip you with the tools and the knowledge to explore the richness and depth of the Bible for yourself. So grab your Bible, take a deep breath, and join us as we explore this week's passages. To learn more about us or to get in touch with us at C3 Church Camden, Picton and Thirroul, visit any of our three locations' websites. That's c3camden.church, c3picton.church and c3thirroul.church. Or you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram and YouTube just by searching for any of our locations' names. So without any further delay, let's dive into today's conversation. Well, hello everybody. Welcome to The Bible. Wait, what? Hello, I am sitting down with Annaleise Forbes. Hello, Annaleise.
Hello, how are you?
I am fantastic. Thanks for being with us. Annaleise is our youth leader at Picton. Oh, one of our youth leaders at C3 Picton, and she's a law student.
I am.
What year are you in at your law?
I'm in my last year, so it's my fifth year.
Fifth year. And then you've got like 45 years of preparation before you actually get to be a partner. Is that how it works?
Pretty much. Pretty much.
That's pretty much how it works, isn't it? How long are you a junior in a law firm before you can advance through the ranks?
You are supervised for, I think it's 18 months to 2 years.
Oh, it's not as long as I thought.
No, so you're supervised.
So when you see it in suits, all the plebs that are just doing all the dirty work, you're not having to do that forever?
Not forever,
Okay.
no. So you're kind of supervised for 18 months
Pull
to
that
2
microphone
years.
a bit closer to yourself. There we go.
There we go.
That's better.
18 months to 2 years. And then after that, you can kind of go off and do your own thing.
You could have your own law practice after that amount of time, could you?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. So you're really only supervised for that 2 years.
Right.
But in most firms, you're not going to reach
You're
that
not
partner
gonna reach a
level
partner
until
level.
you've had it like maybe 10 years
Yeah,
experience.
gotcha. Yeah.
But yeah, only
Yeah.
those 2 years supervised.
Gotcha. No, okay. It's not as bad as I thought it was.
No.
Yeah.
No, it could be a lot worse.
Yeah.
It could be a lot worse.
Yeah, good. Okay. And what are you going to major in your law career?
Well, I'm going into a city law firm that do commercial law. I'm not sure exactly where I will end up.
So that
there.
could be commercial property or commercial.
Yeah, it can be heaps of
anything.
things. So it could be real estate, so doing big real estate transactions, like for big businesses.
Big scale conveyancing kind of stuff.
Yep. Or you can do competition law, so you're working with the companies, making sure that they're not doing misleading and deceptive conduct and things like that. You can go into intellectual property law, so making sure
very broad.
trademarks, copyright, all that kind of stuff, which is really, really interesting. Restructuring of businesses, mergers and acquisitions, so companies taking over each other and all things like that. So
that's very broad. And you're talking big business here, not small business.
No, this is massive business.
These are like banks and building companies and
massive
right,
companies.
Gotcha.
So like companies that are on the stock exchange and everything like
right.
that as well. So it's big scale. So
Yes.
that's where I'm going to be. I don't know exactly.
So your billables are several $100s an hour in a business like that?
Yes. You also
or in the
work
thousands
hours,
of dollars an hour?
You work hours and hours and hours though. So
yeah, gotcha.
yeah, but I'm not sure exactly where I'll end up.
Okay, sure.
But that's the kind of law firm that I'm working in.
Great.
So
Okay. Sounds like, well, we're going to be talking about law today.
we are.
It's really good that you've got some of the most law-based chapters in the book of Deuteronomy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and like this is actually like Deuteronomy. This is the third week of our Deuteronomy series, but this is a couple of months at least before we do this.
Yeah.
I'm neck deep in Deuteronomy myself, prepping for all the hard questions that I was going to get asked. And you've got a section of the of the book of Deuteronomy, which is there's narrative at the beginning and there's narrative at the end, but there's this section in the middle which is very like you were saying off air before, it's very law based. It's very just
absolutely.
if this happens, this almost case law kind of feel, isn't it?
Absolutely. And when I was looking into it, because I like to know the context of the books that I'm reading and studying and everything like that, and when I was looking at the book of Deuteronomy and its context, you can see that this is just one of the sections that Moses is preaching and writing down those laws, and you see them pop up so many different times in the Torah.
Yeah.
And you're kind of like, oh, why?
Why is it being repeated?
Why is it being repeated? And it's because you can see human frailty throughout the Torah, and that the people need reassuring of
Constant
these laws and
reminder
and everything like that. And that is something that I was like, that's really interesting, because you see that in normal law as well. Like in the real world, you see that as well. And
how so?
You can see in the case laws things pop up over and over and over again, and the judges will, when they're making a decision on a case, they will go back to that case before and the one before that and the one before that, and things might develop from that.
Right.
But they're constantly being reminded of what's come before.
So is that right in my understanding? Because it'll be useful when we get into how we interpret Deuteronomy. So we're doing a bit of an intro here, but I think this is why it's good to have someone like a legal expert like yourself, because the way our legal system works is they're always appealing to precedent, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously the foundation is those laws that are in the statutes that are set by the government, but the court has the ability to make a decision, and from that decision then follow on from it and refer back to it and say, this is what happened last time, so this is what we're going to do this time. And you can kind of see that happening in Deuteronomy and the Torah. You can see they go back to what they were doing before, and you can see where they've failed and they've fallen from God, and then they go back to what they were doing before,
go back to the original
and
thing.
refer to it and be like, actually we're supposed to be doing this way. So then they'll start doing it that way, and then you see them fall again, and then they come back.
That's really helpful.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much how it happens in our system. It's not that different.
Absolutely.
So when a case comes before a court in our judicial system, we have use the word statute. Is that right?
Yeah,
so the statute is set in concrete.
Yeah.
That's the law that's been approved by the authorities.
Yeah.
And then what's happening in a legal courtroom is they are appealing to how to apply that statute to a particular case.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the words of statute, their interpretation
is open
based on the case law.
Yeah.
So things can be interpreted and changed over time with that case law, but it always goes back to something before it.
So what they're doing is they're taking the statute, there's an underlying principle behind it, and then they're applying it case by case by case. But
that's exactly
but appealing but the system is obviously working in such a way that they appeal to, in the case of such and such in 1974, this was the outcome, therefore this is how it should be interpreted in 2024.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, yeah.
That's exactly right.
I think we'll find that that's not that dissimilar to how we're supposed to read Torah law. Yeah. So we're going to get into some pretty, some of these laws, to be honest, are quite confronting for us in the 21st century, aren't they? So I don't know if you're going to ask any questions about that, but we might actually get there.
Yeah.
How do you want to do it? Do you want us to just kind of, have you got your notes and questions set like chapter by chapter, or are they?
I have broken it down chapter by chapter because I thought that might be easier.
That's an easy way. Well,
but
yep.
Before we...
Yeah, ask away.
I was going to say, before we even jump into the verses, I know very surface level what Passover is and what it's kind of about, but I want to know a bit more about it, why it was so significant, and like if it's relevant to us today.
Sure. Okay.
Before we even jump in, because the first part of Deuteronomy 16 is about Passover and observing it every single month.
All right. Well, let's do that. Let's go there. So by this time, Passover has been instituted 40 years before this. So when the book of Deuteronomy, the Israelites have been living in the desert for 40 years, wandering around over numbers of different places. And they'd come out of, 40 years before, they'd come out of slavery in Exodus. They've come out of slavery in Egypt. That was called the Exodus, the book of Exodus, which is the second book of the Torah. And at that night, on that final Passover night, that's when God commanded them to sacrifice a Passover lamb, eat a meal together, and celebrate the fact that God had passed over them in the plague of the firstborn. And that became an instituted festival that they were commanded, even from the very first night, that they were to celebrate that on a certain date every year, an annual festival, one of the key annual festivals. So here we are 40 years later. Moses is about to die, and the book of Deuteronomy is really happening in it's happening in a few hours, really. Unlike Genesis, which spans a long time, Exodus is quite a long time. We're talking about a final speech. The whole book is really a speech. So part of that is he's instituting this, or reminding them about this Passover that they are to have every year. They probably have been having it every year in the desert.
Yeah.
We don't know. I don't think there's any reference to them definitely doing it, but I think Moses would have overseen that they celebrated it every year.
Yeah.
And so I think he's just going to institute what that is. And it's this festival that celebrates God passing over the people of Israel and protecting them from the plague of the firstborn.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting that it keeps coming back up and they keep doing it every single year.
Yeah, and it was the primary festival of the people of Israel throughout all time, throughout the Old Testament. And even today, to an average Jewish person, if you said, what's the big festival, they would say Seder, the Passover festival. They would say that's what their big one is. They have a day called Yom Kippur, which is a day where everything shuts down and they kind of celebrate, or they don't celebrate. They kind of just give their sins over to God. But they would say that this is fundamental to them because this represents the greatest act of God on their behalf.
Yeah.
The deliverance of God's people out of Egypt up until the time of Jesus' resurrection was the greatest miracle that the Jews would look at and say, God did that for us.
Yeah.
He protected us. He brought us out of Egypt. That was his hand. He brought us out by his strong right hand. So that became that principle.
Yeah.
And then, of course, it's no surprise that Jesus becomes the Passover lamb and he's the ultimate fulfillment of this very message. But that's what it really represents.
Yeah. Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense and adds so much more context to it for me.
Okay.
But it's quite interesting that links back to Jesus as well and how he was the ultimate Passover lamb as well. And it's quite interesting. It's like
it's totally.
The links in the Bible are
They're
crazy.
so cool, aren't they?
They're crazy.
That's for sure.
I don't have any specific verses here that I want to pull out, but throughout this kind of short section of Deuteronomy 16, it mentions bread and yeast and things like that. Does that have any
significance on why they would have bread without yeast?
Yeah.
So it was linked to, well, yeast takes on its own meaning, but let's park that and I'll come back to that in a moment. But in its first Passover festival, when the idea was that the Passover was something they did very hastily, like at short notice. They all sat in Egypt and Moses said, tonight's the night, God's going to deliver you. You haven't got time to bake your bread with yeast in it. Because it would take time to bake bread and mix the yeast in. So they ate this meal. It says they ate the meal in haste. They were supposed to be eating it quickly, like have your tunic tucked into your belt, which meant get ready to go.
Yeah.
Eat it with your staff in hand, which meant get ready to go. So this meal is being eaten in haste. And so it became something they would eat without leaven, without yeast.
Yeah.
To symbolise the fact they didn't have time to bake their bread in a hurry. They just had to eat it with it unleavened.
Yeah, right.
Part 2 of that is that from this point on, yeast in the Bible gets a metaphorical, it sort of becomes metaphorically recognised as part of sin, as something bad.
Yeah.
So Jesus will even refer to it. He says like a little bit of yeast works through the whole batch of dough. I think it might be the Apostle Paul says that. But the sense is yeast becomes identified with sin and therefore a little bit of sin gets in and messes things up in your life. Yeah. So it takes on this quite a sinister kind of metaphor, and that's how the Jews interpreted yeast.
Yeah, right.
If that makes sense. And it became known as the Gentiles. So there was one festival, one festival where they could all have yeast, and it was actually the one that was symbolic of including the Gentiles. All the others that were very Jewish specific, no yeast.
Yeah, right. That's super interesting, especially when you look at verse 4, because it says, let no yeast be found in your possession in all your land for 7 days. So it's really interesting that it has that symbolic meaning of sin and then trying to be free from sin for 7 days. If you look at it in that perspective of not actually being literal yeast, but
It was
in that
it
sense of
represented
being,
something else.
Yeah.
So they would actually go through their houses. So a Jewish woman in preparation for the Passover festival, they with normal practice is they would scour their house for every little crumb of yeast. Now you can imagine they're baking their own bread, so yeast is a common part of their thing.
And it's so tiny.
It's so tiny, and they're little grains of yeast, and they would diligently remove yeast from their house.
Yeah.
That could seem to be, that's just a religious act. And it could become that. But it was, like you say, it was supposed to symbolize this purification. If I'm going to put this much effort into making sure there's no yeast in my house, I'm going to prepare my heart for the Passover festival and make sure that I've rooted the sin and the sinful thoughts out of my life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, that's good. I like that.
Yeah, which means it takes work, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. And it would take work to clean that much yeast out of someone's house as well, especially if it's something that they rely on.
Yeah, they would have to sweep
so
the house.
Often. And later on in that same verse, in verse 4, it talks about sacrificing meat during the day and in the evening. So is that significant as well? Like, does that have some kind of metaphorical meaning like the yeast did, or? So
where it says when you sacrifice the Passover lamb on the evening of the first day. Yeah. So there was significance in their Passover meal was at night. And the idea of having to, like it says, what's it say? Sacrifice the Passover lamb on the evening of the first day and do not let any of the meat remain until the next morning. I wonder what their reason was for not letting it. I mean, the meat wasn't going to spoil overnight. I would think it's in their context, it's probably linked to the fact that they were up and going first thing in the morning.
Yeah.
So they didn't take their lamb with them. So the lamb became that they sacrificed. They were to eat that meal and then be on their way the next morning. There may be more depth to it than that.
Yeah.
I think that's what it was to them. However, it also took on a prophetic significance because the true Passover lamb, Jesus, he wasn't allowed to stay on the cross till overnight. They wanted to take his body down. But they didn't want his body hanging on the cross during the Passover. So the Passover would start on the evening at sundown and would go through the next 7 days. But the Passover day the day of the Passover would be the day after they've eaten. So it took on a prophetic significance for Jesus. I can definitely say that because I think scholars would agree there's a link there. Not sure that they wouldn't have been thinking about that. They're just, why is Moses saying to them, don't let any of it wait till the next evening? Beyond what it symbolises for them leaving Egypt, I don't think I can think of anything else.
Yeah, that's super interesting that it links back to Jesus staying up on the cross as well. I hadn't put that together, so that's really interesting that it links back to that as well. It seems that kind of a lot of Moses ends up linking back to Jesus. Like there's a lot of similarities between the two.
Totally.
And it's crazy to see how many times they actually link back together.
Yeah, exactly. Jesus is the fulfillment at such a deep level of so many of these things. So it's like you say, link back. It's actually almost link forward. Like they're doing these things in their context, 1400 BC, completely unaware that their ultimate fulfillment lies in Christ in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's like rather than seeing Jesus linking back to these, we need to think of these as pointing forward to Jesus. Does that make sense? I don't think they realised that necessarily.
Yeah,
but
no,
that's
probably not.
With the benefit of hindsight now, we go, Jesus is the actual Passover.
Yeah.
He's the fulfillment of this.
Yeah.
Rather than, that he's an example of this. No, this is actually pointing forward to him.
Yeah, definitely. It's a bit interesting.
Yeah.
And in Deuteronomy 16, there's mention of other festivals. So how did they link back in with this Passover? So there's the Festival of the Weeks and Festival of Tabernacles. Yeah,
so they're all at different times, and these were related to these were related to harvests. So in ancient cultures that were agricultural, everything was related to harvest. Their whole livelihood came around harvest. I mean, you probably see this in country towns. You certainly see it in country American movies where they still have the pumpkin festival, all that sort of stuff. Harvest festivals are still probably not to the same degree that they would have been in ancient times, but harvesting was a time of happiness, a time of celebration because they had food on their table.
Yeah.
So these were like God repurposing what they were used to. They, mind you, in their time in Egypt, they probably never really were able to have festivals at all.
Yeah.
because they worked 7 days a week.
Yeah.
You know, they were slaves. They were in bondage. So this is partly God setting up some patterns for them and saying, I'm your provider now.
Mm-hmm.
I've provided the harvest for you. I've provided the rain to produce these crops, and you've harvested them. Now celebrate me.
Yeah.
And so they were related to different times. So one was related to the Festival of Harvest or the Festival of Weeks.
Mm-hmm.
It says count off 7 weeks from when you first began to cut the grain at the time of the harvest. So they would celebrate this Festival of Weeks. It was actually supposed to be, I think it was 7 weeks after Passover.
Yeah.
Okay, so they have the Passover festival. 7 weeks later, they have this Festival of Weeks. It's called the Festival of Pentecost.
Yeah.
It's actually the same as we have Pentecost Sunday.
Yeah.
Pentecost Sunday is 7 weeks after. We've just had Easter Sunday.
Yeah.
So 7 weeks after Easter Sunday is Pentecost Sunday. So that's the day. It symbolises the coming of, for the New Testament, it symbolises the day of Pentecost and the birth of the church. But for these guys, it was this time when they would celebrate a particular harvest.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next one, the Festival of Shelters, it says in verse 13, you must observe the Festival of Shelters for 7 days at the end of the harvest season. So this one would come at a different time. And got one at the start, one at the end kind of thing. That's how it worked. And each of these festivals would be a time when they wouldn't work. So just as they stopped for Sabbath one day every week, within these festivals, there were certain other days that they would do where they wouldn't work either. I don't think it was like a 7-day festival. I don't think they had 7 Sabbaths. I don't think, but there might have been 1 or 2 Sabbaths extra.
Yeah, okay.
As well as the normal one where they wouldn't do any work. And that's really linked to, you just got to think about it as an agrarian culture.
Yeah.
So much of these Old Testament laws don't make sense if we don't think about an agricultural culture that they lived in.
Of course. And you've mentioned it a few times, but in Deuteronomy 16, there is the word 7. I don't know how many times.
Lots of times.
Lots and lots of times.
Yeah, good question.
So what is, I know a little bit about 7 in the Bible, but what is the main significance?
So 7, I'm not sure why, why originally, but 7 becomes known as the number of completion. And when I say I'm not sure why, I mean, it's in the Genesis narrative, the creation narrative. God rested on the 7th day. It was complete. So it becomes known as the number of completion. What I'm not sure about is whether or not it begins with a Genesis narrative or whether or not it might have been already seen within ancient cultures as completion.
Okay.
But certainly for the Bible, anytime you see the number of 7 in the Old Testament especially, and the New Testament, the Jews saw that as the number of completeness, wholeness, fullness, something coming to its ultimate purpose.
Yeah.
So anytime that you're always thinking about that. What does this mean? It means fullness, completeness, wholeness of purpose. So you celebrating this for 7 days.
Yeah.
It's a complete festival.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Lots of these festivals, like you were saying, they kind of don't seem relevant to us unless you're thinking about it from that agricultural kind of perspective. So how is it something that
how are they relevant?
Yeah, how are they relevant? What can we learn from them?
Well, that's a great question. And there are Christian groups and Jewish Christian groups, Jews who've become Christians and Christians who are Gentiles as well, who really advocate for the celebration of these feasts still. Now, if you said to most Christians today, what are the main festivals or feasts? Well, we just had one 3 days ago, Easter. We would generally say Christmas and Easter as the main festivals, but they're not really, they're fairly relatively new compared to this. They came along later, and there are many Christians who do celebrate these feasts. Now, these feasts in and of themselves were related to, as I say, festivals to do with harvest, etc. They were related to times when you would trust God, either thank God for the harvest or thank God in anticipation of the next harvest. They were related to that provision upon waiting upon God. But each of these festivals actually has a fulfillment in Christ.
Yeah, okay.
So we have the Passover we just talked about. Jesus as the Passover lamb is sacrificed on Passover. 50 days later, 7 weeks and a day later, we have the Feast of Pentecost, the birth of the church, the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. That all happens at the Feast of Weeks.
Yeah.
And the final feast, which is the Feast of Tabernacles, I think it was, the Feast of Shavuot, that festival, I think, off the top of my head, it actually gets, it speaks of Jesus' return.
Right,
It's
okay.
linked to metaphors, the analogies, the meanings are linked to Jesus coming back again.
Yeah, okay.
That's kind of how they have a fulfillment in Jesus.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
That's
I just
super
can't remember exactly how that is, but that festival of, I don't have my notes in front of me.
interesting.
I have taught this multiple times over the years, but yeah, they all linked. They all have their fulfillment in Jesus.
Yeah, wow.
So how are they relevant? They're relevant because they point to Jesus.
Jesus, yeah. Wow, that's so interesting. And then you kind of see in Deuteronomy 16, it's a bit of a weird jump between these festivals, and then you jump straight into the appointment of judges and officials.
Yeah, it's like it changes tack completely, doesn't it?
And it's completely railroading where you think
Yes,
this chapter's going to go.
It's almost like it should be two separate chapters.
Yeah, you honestly think it should be, because it's talking about, it goes straight from verse 17, which is talking about bringing gifts in preparation of the way of the Lord your God, and then jump straight to appoint judges and officials over every tribe, and it seems like such a strange turn of events.
Yeah, exactly.
Is there like a significant reason for the turn of events?
No, I think it's just the way because the Bible, the chapters have been put in later.
Yeah.
To me, I've often thought, you'll see this a few times in the Bible, you think, why is that there?
Yeah.
They put chapter markers in the craziest of places. They put them where they shouldn't.
Yeah.
And then in a place like this, they don't put one when they probably should.
Yeah, it seems so strange, especially when you jump forward and it talks more about the laws and
yeah,
things
we're now.
like
It's
that.
almost like at that point. So what was Deuteronomy 15? Oh, there was stuff in there around release. Yeah, Deuteronomy 15's got stuff about laws as well.
Yeah.
And then you've just got the random. It's probably more that the whole Passover thing is out of place.
Yeah.
It's like they've inserted that in between a whole bunch of laws.
Yeah.
That's probably a way to put it.
Yeah.
I'm not sure why it's there.
Yeah, it's a strange kind of,
Yeah.
it's a weird backflip.
I mean, it's essentially still rules. It's still guidance.
Definitely.
It's still Torah. It's still instruction.
Yeah.
The word Torah means instruction.
Yeah.
So we translate it law, and that's where we get a bit confused, because we then straight away start to think case law.
Yeah.
But it's really instruction. You're supposed to meditate on it. It's supposed to show you how to do life. So, yeah, these commands around these festivals is definitely Torah. It's definitely instruction. It's how to do worship well.
Yeah.
But it's just random that it's been inserted in amongst a whole bunch of other rules.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think it's almost like this is now going to go back to what was being discussed in chapter 15, which we haven't done. It's last week's podcast.
So going on with that Judges section of this chapter, it has in verse 19, do not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise. Why? What's the bribe about?
What's the bribe about?
Yeah.
We have you probably know it still happens anyway, but we have laws in place, in Western culture where, to prevent this. But most cultures, even today, a bribe is still, the ethics of our legal systems and judicial systems aren't great. Yeah. And so Moses is clearly saying he's saying appoint these judges, these officials, because Moses couldn't do it all. And he understood that you're going to have layers of governance in towns and villages and districts, etc. Because these people are about to move from being a nomadic tribe living in the desert to now living in around cities and so on. Yeah. So they're going to need some structure of governance. And he's saying bribes is not the way it works. What's he say? You must never twist justice or show partiality. Never accept a bribe, for bribes blind the eyes of the wise and corrupt the decisions of the godly. And I don't know. I think it talks to itself that it's probably more that if you take a bribe, you'll become blind. Like you lose all ability for reason. Yeah. Because now your motivation for issuing a decision is related to dollars and cents. Yeah. It's not related to what's truly just.
It's interesting that that's called out in that paragraph. Like it's kind of the only thing that's kind of called out in that paragraph there. So it's interesting that is something that got pinpointed in that moment.
Yes. Yeah, well, if he's going to go, he's setting it as a benchmark value for these judges. So this is how these judges would have worked. It's probably a good moment to mention this, because they have 613 laws, and we always go, 613 laws, that's a lot. But you're studying law. 613 laws is
not that many.
Not that many, right? It really isn't, is it?
It's really not that many.
I mean, your average lawyer is going to have volumes and volumes and volumes of case law on their shelves, right? That they go through. So that's actually not that much. There's nowhere near enough in the Torah to cover every situation.
Yeah.
And that was never the intention. The way these laws that we're going to read are written is they're written as examples. So if you're one of these judges or a person with authority, you can appeal to, you can look at that law. Not what you're expected to do is not see it as case law. You're supposed to look at that example, like an example, we're going to look at some, an example might be, okay, so your ox gnaws your, gores your neighbour's ox. What are you going to do about it? Now you're supposed to, the judge is supposed to look at that, look at kind of the value that law is representing, and then use their wisdom, their own common sense, free from bribes, to issue what they would regard as a fair decision in the particular case.
Yeah.
And so it's setting right from the start. Don't twist justice.
Yeah. That's such an important message as well. And I think it kind of links back to God's character as well, that no matter what we do, he's going to give his justice, not what we think is just, or there's nothing that we can do to twist his arm as well.
Totally.
Yeah.
And the irony of it is we're going to go on in the rest of the Old Testament and we're going to find out that those in authority completely did the opposite.
Yeah.
They took bribes, they abused the poor, they favoured the rich, they twisted justice for their own gain. And in fact, most of the prophets, that's what they spend their time doing. They're not most of their prophetic work in the Old Testament is calling out Israel's leaders for their abuse of this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Abusing their power.
Yeah.
These are trusted positions.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it's the same in our judicial system. We don't take it, it's a trusted position.
Yeah.
And they shouldn't take it lightly. And our authorities will take it seriously if that trust is abused. Because they, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, totally. And that's God's heart, God's standard. You said that.
Yeah. That kind of links into the next section, the last couple of verses as well, which are about worshipping other gods and not to do that and not to erect stone statues. And it just shows that it's another element of God's character as well, that he hates those kinds of things and won't let them stand. And
So it says, let true justice prevail, so you may live long in the land.
Yeah.
You must never set up a wooden Asherah pole or build an altar beside the altar that you build for the Lord. Never set up sacred pillars of worship. So what would be wrong with that from a justice perspective? Why link in foreign worship with these judges and justice and all that sort of stuff? Do you know where I'm going with that?
Yeah, I guess if you're looking at it from a perspective of our world and the year that we live in, it's almost like a form of treason against the country that you're from or the ruler of that country or whatever. Like if you go in and you start saying, oh, this person shouldn't be in charge, this one should be, that can be a form of treason. So it's almost like the same thing. It's linking that element of justice of you have to, you can't be doing those kinds of things that are unjust and are wrong.
Yeah.
And then putting that on the same level as worshipping something else or putting something else above something else. In God's eyes, that's
treasonous.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, let me dig a little bit further because you're on the right track. Yeah. Because this is the question a lot of people ask. They go, God's just jealous and he just wants all the worship for himself, and he's just, some people will go, your God, look at this, and they go, your God says that you need to destroy all Asherah poles and get rid of all the foreign gods and so on. That's just because he's a narcissist and wants it all for himself. Because you could read that into that.
Yeah, you absolutely could.
But what's happening is these other forms of worship that were taking place, that they are told, don't build a pole there that worships a foreign god like Asherah.
Yeah.
It's not because somehow God was threatened by the worship of those gods. It was because the practices of those gods and what those gods demanded of the people was often unjust. It was often sexually perverted. It was often causing the unfair treatment of the poor. It would often be related to young girls being sold into sexual slavery, often be children being, sacrificed, all kinds of horrible, horrific things that were linked to this kind of worship. So it's not that God is a narcissist saying, don't do this. He's saying, no, this is so foreign, this way of worshiping.
Yeah.
Don't be like the nations around about you. That's what they do.
Yeah.
You be different. You live by my standard, which is fairness for all, equity for all, justice for all,
Yeah.
treating the poor and the vulnerable
Yeah.
as valuable. And so much of this other worship was actually the exact opposite of that.
Yeah.
So can you see how it's actually like God's saying it for our good?
Yeah. Absolutely.
And if we bring it into our 21st century, which is what you said there, a great point you made, we need to look at, well, where do we do that?
Yeah.
We might not be bowing down before an Asherah pole, but where do we let the systems of the world cause us to abuse the weak?
Yeah.
Where are we living, benefiting from others who are suffering?
Yeah.
That's the call. Because when we're doing that, we're worshipping Asherah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's so easy to let those other things come in
Yes.
and distract you and take your mind away from God. And then it really takes something to snap you out of it. And this, you see through the whole Torah, that snap comes every couple of
Pretty
chapters.
constantly, doesn't it?
It comes constantly. And it just reminds you back to the human frailty that we were talking about a bit earlier, that people just need constant reminders that they just need to have that snap out of it, because we just always fall back into those habits. We keep
falling back into those selfish, self-serving habits.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we need to be constantly reminded. That's what God's calling us to.
Yeah.
All right, well, that's chapter 16. Should we go to chapter 17?
Absolutely. So it's pretty interesting that, as we were saying before, it kind of jumps around. It's almost like the chapter end is halfway through this kind of section, because it doesn't have a title or anything. But it's interesting to see in this first verse that says, "Do not sacrifice to the Lord your God an ox or a sheep that has any defect or flaw in it, for that would be detestable to him." It's quite interesting. That reminds me forward really to the sacrifice of Jesus, because he was that perfect sacrifice that had no flaw. So it's interesting that this chapter starts with that, after talking about gods and worshipping other gods, and then this section of the chapter as well continues to go on with that. It's interesting that it's got that.
Why don't we take a moment and unpack
absolutely.
Why? Let's ask the question. This is just to help our readers think, because each of these laws, a lot of them don't always seem connected.
Yeah.
They just seem like they're a verse here and a verse there. But this is Torah. This is instruction. So this is teaching us something. So it's perfectly okay to wrestle with what's going on here. So let's think about it. It says, never sacrifice sick or defective cattle, sheep, or goats to the Lord your God. So a few things that come to mind. First of all, in the 21st century, we go, what's with the whole sacrifice? That's so antiquated anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay? So we could think that. Or if we're prepared to put ourselves back into the first century, into the 1400 thereabouts, okay, animal sacrifice was a standard practice among all ancient cultures.
Yeah.
So let's take that as a given. Why would God say never sacrifice a sick or defective one? Because I'd be thinking, well, my God actually cares for the sick and the defective.
Yeah.
Is this he's saying the sick and defective aren't as valuable or are not as important and he won't accept them? Can you see how you can wrestle with all that? And you've got to then go, we can filter this through what we know of Jesus.
Yeah.
Because Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. So if we think about that, we go, well, that can't be right either, because plenty of times Jesus spent time with the sick.
Yeah.
He sought out the sick. So that's not the heart of God.
Yeah.
So what's going on? And this is where I would land on that. I would go, okay, so he's saying never sacrifice something that's sick or defective. Now, if they're in an agricultural culture, it would be easier for them to, if they needed to make a sacrifice, okay, I've got to make a sacrifice to the Lord today. I'll go through my flock. I'll find the weakest, lamest one I can find, and I'll just give that to God. I've made my sacrifice, ticked my sacrifice box, and now I'm all good.
Yeah.
I think that's what God's saying. Why is he detesting the gift? He's detesting the gift because their heart wasn't in it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. When I actually took a little bit of a different point of view, and I don't know.
No, that's good. I
don't know what's right or wrong. But
tell me what you're thinking.
I was thinking of, if you think of us as the sheep and Jesus as the shepherd, the ultimate sacrifice that was pure and clean and fulfilled what needed to be fulfilled by the sacrifice. We as broken, dirty, flawed people cannot fulfill that sacrifice. So if we can't fulfill that sacrifice, then a defective, flawed sheep or ox can't fulfill the sacrifice that needed to be fulfilled by the people that were
So we needed a perfect lamb.
Yeah. So they needed the perfect or their perfect lamb.
I reckon that's just as valid as what I said, if not more valid. That's looking forward. You're reading it through the lens of Christ there and going, okay, we're not able to be a sufficient sacrifice. Even our best efforts are going to come up short. Yeah, I think that's a valid way to look at this.
Yeah, that's the way that I look at it. Yeah.
And this is why it's good to read the Bible in community.
Yeah, definitely.
Because, there's part of why I love doing this podcast is because I hear people's perspectives like that and I go, I don't think I would have ever thought of it that way, but that's really helpful. Yeah. So we should be reading in a community. That's why it's good to listen to podcasts like this and discuss things, because both of those are really, and this is how they would have read the Bible. They read it in community. They talked about it. What does that mean? Like a couple of weeks ago, I think you were out in the kids when I did that Q&A kind of session. Yeah. Yeah, I did a Q&A session. So rather than preach, we just read and then we just talked about it and talked it through. That's actually a good way to learn, which is what we're doing on the podcast here. So I love what you said there. Often with these, there's no one right answer either. I think that's the beautiful thing about the scripture is we can now look at that. And I think both those are valid. Yeah. I think there's definitely something to be said for challenging me not to give God my second best.
Yeah, definitely.
If I'm going to make an offering to God of my life, because I am an offering, there's a sense in which I can't be a good enough offering. I need Jesus. But there's also a sense in which we are called to offer our lives as living sacrifices. So if I'm just haphazard and not committed to God and I just show up in church when it suits me, just have a half-hearted attitude, well, I don't expect God to honour that because I haven't purified my heart. So I think there's validity in that, while also knowing that my best efforts will still fall short of what God needs. Hence, I need a saviour.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you were saying there about being half-hearted about things, that reminds me of the verse. I can't remember where it is. But he calls the people lukewarm. He's like, don't be lukewarm. And it links straight back to that as well. And you just see that
half-hearted, haphazard attitude.
Yeah, absolutely. That's not what God wants from us. He wants us to be all in.
He wants our best.
Yeah.
And the way I heard it said years ago is, Jesus died for me, so the least I can do is live for him.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
Yeah, and it's not that I'm living and earning my salvation and it's not that that's somehow making me a better person. It's the response of my heart to what Jesus has already done for me, that I want to live a life that honours him.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's all about that heart condition.
It is.
And I think that kind of goes on with the rest of this section as well, that talks about the worship and things like that. If you're worshipping those other gods, like we said, your heart is not in the right place, and that's a violation of the covenant that they had with God in that time as well. That links back to then that paragraph at the end of chapter 16 as well about the gods. It's the same thing.
Yes,
that's where that link is. It's not a random sentence. That's where that
definitely
link is.
There's a flow of thought on from what he just said about not worshipping foreign gods. Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely. So in this part, we can also kind of see that their sacrifice was a form of worship to God. So do we have something equivalent that we should be doing under the new covenant?
Great
that's
question.
Kind of equivalent to worshipping God with a sacrifice?
Brilliant.
Or is that being fulfilled by Jesus?
Yes and yes. That's a really good question. Yes, in a sense, Jesus has fulfilled all animal sacrifices.
Yeah.
They all find their fulfillment in his death. Yeah. Absolutely. We don't sacrifice animals, fortunately, anymore.
Thank goodness.
The carpet here at C3 Thirroul would be really bloody and messy.
It would be horrible.
It would be horrible. So, yes, in that sense. However, there are references in the New Testament which point back to show us what was really going on when they were sacrificing animals. It was not just about the act of sacrificing an animal. It was the act of their heart. So there's a scripture in Hebrews that says something like, talks about we offer the I think literally it says in Greek, the bulls of our lips. It's a weird statement. The bulls of our lips. The sacrifice of our lips. So our praise is, praise can be a sacrifice. Yeah. It can be hard to praise God when things aren't going well. Yeah. I mean, that's not hard. I mean, you went through some pretty tough stuff a few years ago. I don't want to say it without you saying it, but you went through some pretty hard. It wasn't, praise isn't the easiest thing to do in those moments.
No, it's definitely not. And it's absolutely a choice to continue to praise in those moments. And I feel like a lot of people can fall away in those times.
Yes, that's right.
And it's absolutely a choice to continue going.
It's a choice to continue going, to offer that sacrifice of praise. So that term, sacrifice of praise, is a very common one in the New Testament. So that's part of the sacrifice. Part of our servant engaging with church life, serving the Lord with our action. Those sorts of things are all aspects of our sacrifice.
Yeah.
However, just like in the Old Testament, it's possible to show up at the temple, hand over your lamb for sacrifice, and walk away, and you've done nothing in your heart. It's actually possible to come to church, go through the motions, look like you're doing all the sacrifices that we expect, and it's still nothing of your heart.
Yeah.
So occurs a couple of times in the Old Testament. I think it's 2 Samuel, 1 Samuel. I think Samuel rebukes Saul, and he says the sacrifices of the Lord are that he's looking for is obedience to the way of the Lord. And in Psalm 51, David says, Lord, I would have offered lamb. This is after he's committed sin with Bathsheba and Uriah and all that. And he says, I'd offer lambs, but that's not really what you're looking for. And he says the sacrifices you're looking for are a broken spirit and a contrite heart. So whether it's giving your tithes, coming to church, serving God in the 21st century, or offering your lambs and goats and doves in the first century, it's always been about a heart devoted to God.
Yeah.
That's what God's looking for.
Yeah.
More than anything. Even all the old language around circumcision. We're going to see this in Deuteronomy. We're going to see it referencing circumcision. But towards the end of Deuteronomy, Moses is going to say, God's really looking for a circumcision of your heart. He actually uses that term.
Yeah.
And it gets picked up time and time again in the Old Testament. It's not about circumcision of a foreskin. It's about the circumcision, the cutting away of the stuff off your heart that has gotten in the way.
Yeah.
God's always looking at heart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting if you look a little further down in verse 5, it says, take the man or the woman who has done this evil deed to your city gate and stone that person to death, in that context of praising another idol or another god. It's reassuring to us with that retrospective knowledge, looking back and knowing that we aren't going to have that punishment for our fallings, because it happens a lot, and that Jesus fulfilled that for us. And
how do you feel about reading it there? To be honest, like you read that's capital punishment.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Like I know if I was back here, I'd be shivering in my boots. Like, that's so scary, that me falling short, because I know that it's something that I've experienced, everyone's experienced. Like some thought can creep in and suddenly that takes your mind off everything else. So it's reassuring for us now to know that when that thought does creep in and I have to get it out of my head, that I'm not going to be punished the same way that these people were punished, because we do have Jesus that died for us. And it's actually interesting that link just popped in, because we did a talk on anxiety the other week at youth group, and that was exactly what we were talking about, how those thoughts can pop in and they can be all-consuming, or take over. And it's really reassuring for us to know that in our time we don't have to worry about our lives being ended because of our falling short.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate for a moment, because this is Torah, this is instruction for us, and it's basically Moses saying, if someone worships another god, kill them. Yeah. Capital punishment. Yeah. Now, we wouldn't dream of doing that. If someone's worshipping a Hindu god, we wouldn't advocate for. There might be a few crazy Christian nationalists around who would, but generally speaking, the normal Christians don't advocate for that. Yeah. But that's precisely because we are informed by 2,000 years of Judeo-Christian history revealed in Jesus that says that's not the way it was. Yeah. So we need to read these laws through their time frame, their lens. Yeah. And while they seem antiquated, archaic, even violent to us, the Mosaic laws, the laws of Moses in the Torah, are actually quite progressive in comparison to many of the other ancient Near Eastern laws around. So that you need to compare law to law. Yeah. And you would find that, while God is saying, there's still underlying instruction for us here. There's not that we dismiss it, because I wouldn't advocate, if part of our code of conduct for our team at church was if I catch you worshipping, or doing something wrong, I'm going to take you to the stone to death. Yeah, take you to the city gates. Let's take you out the front door of the church and stone you to death. We wouldn't advocate. We wouldn't stand for that, and yet that seems to be it. So there's instruction, there's teaching here. We have to give the benefit to the doubt to these people in their time. When we do that, we go, okay, what's the instruction? The instruction is back to exactly what you just read.
Yeah,
it's that the worship of other gods, and whether that's gods of money or sex or power, which was really most of the ancient gods they worship came down to those three. Yeah, we say we're much more advanced now. We still worship money, sex, and power too. So we come, and those things God's saying, the reason you need to get serious about them is they will take you. They will destroy you. They will destroy the people around you. Yeah. And Jesus kind of metaphorically says, if your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out, throw it away. Now we know he's not saying physically gouge out your eye, chop your arm off. Yeah. But he's using this metaphorical language, hearkening back to some of these pretty harsh Deuteronomy laws. Yeah. But he's trying to say this is how seriously you need to take sin.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's really interesting that you link it back to other laws that were in other communities at that time. Like, that's not something that I really know anything about. But it's interesting that you link it back to that, because a lot of people look at these verses, especially non-believers, and they say, your God is so harsh. How can you serve someone so violent? Everything like that. And then if you put it into that context of the time, not now, and you think about everything happening around them, the people around them, what people around them are like, everything like that, you can actually see that, no, our God is merciful, but he is also just.
So good. All right, so let's that's such a good way you put that. Honestly, that was so superb. So because that's a common question. Yeah. How can your God be God violent?
All the time,
of course you would, and it's really valid. So there's a couple of things you can say. First of all, help people to realize that the reason they have that value judgment, that they know that this is wrong, is precisely because they've actually grown up in a society that has been informed by the values of Jesus Christ. Yeah. That's actually the irony of it. There are plenty of countries around the world where Jesus' values haven't infiltrated the judicial systems and the social systems, where people still think that capital punishment or chopping off a hand for someone who's died is normal. Yeah. They still think that because they haven't been informed by Jesus. So let people see that. I'm not talking about point your finger and have an argument with them. I'm just saying graciously you can share that with them. And then, yes, the next step is to go back and actually compare them. So like the Code of Hammurabi, which is an ancient Near East law code, which predates the Mosaic law code by a couple of hundred years, you'll actually see there's a lot of similarities. If you can actually pull them up alongside each other, and you'll actually see there's a lot of things that the Mosaic law has that seem almost similar. But when you rank them, you'll actually see that the law of Moses is higher in its morality than the law, especially for the protection of the vulnerable and the weak and women caught in adultery and all this sort of stuff. It seems hard to us, but compared to the ancient laws where there was no rights whatsoever for women, these women actually had more rights. Yeah. Certainly not where we want that to be, but much more rights than those codes around about them, or children or any other vulnerable people group. I think that's the way to view it, is to realise that. And then to realise that, see, what happens is, let me give you an example. Jesus gets questioned by, we might even come to it, but the laws around divorce and marriage, are they? Is there any? No, they're not on this passage. Okay, so might be later on, might be the next week's thing. But just to give you an example of how this works. So Jesus gets questioned by a bunch of religious leaders. In the law, Moses commanded that you could give your wife a certificate of divorce and send her away, right? And they start quoting the Mosaic law. And Jesus actually, he gives us a good way to read these. He says, well, Moses did that, allowed that because of your hard hearts. Yeah. But it wasn't this way in the beginning. He says in the beginning, God's intention in Genesis was that the two would become one and that nothing would separate them. That's God's intention in the beginning. So he basically tells us that these laws that we read in the Torah are not the end in themselves. They are a concession to point us in the right direction towards morality without actually being the full ideal of God's morality. Yeah. God's morality isn't for capital punishment. Yeah. But in a society where they had no concept of putting people in jail, they had no concept of any other any other forms of judicial punishment
Mm.
where they could just kill people at a whim. This actually is it's a concession, yes, but it's a raising of the standard. It's not just allowing carte blanche capital punishment
Yeah.
everywhere. So that's kind of how you have to
Yeah.
read these laws. It's like God is willingly lowering his standard to somehow meet with where humans are at,
Yeah.
but staying morally far enough in front of them that he can pull them in the right
Yeah.
direction.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really interesting way to look at it. And it's that and how these laws affect us in our real in now.
Yeah.
That's something that I've always kind of struggled with. So putting it like that is really
So that's what, because you said that off air
Yeah.
before we started.
Yeah.
How do we do that? And that's how we go, okay, if we understand they're actually a concession,
yeah.
they're not the ideal. The ideal is the Genesis, God's
Yeah.
perfect plan that we would live in harmony with one another and that we wouldn't need any of these laws
Yeah.
because we would honour and love our neighbour as ourselves and we would prefer others over ourselves. In an ideal world, you don't need laws.
No, exactly.
You know, if in the future kingdom, you don't need laws because
exactly.
every person does what's right for
Yeah.
others, not what's right for
Yeah.
themselves. But we don't live it. None of
Yeah.
us live there, right?
Yeah.
So this is a concession. Every rule is a concession to our hard hearts.
Yeah.
But it's God trying to put these rules into place, but encouraging us to look behind them and say, what are they revealing about God's ultimate plan?
Yeah.
Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, do not murder.
Yeah.
But I'm telling you, actually, you know, if you're angry with your brother, that's murder.
Yeah.
So Jesus is pointing to the value
Yeah.
underneath the
Yeah.
act.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. I think that's a great way of looking at the Torah specifically because it does seem very outdated when you read it at
Yes.
service level. If you take it from that deeper level, you can see how the word actually is living.
That's great.
And
You got it, Annaleise.
you can kind of, especially when you're just reading them at service level, you can be like, oh, I don't understand how you can say the word is living when it's telling people that if they worship another idol, go stone them to
Yes,
death.
exactly.
You are like, how is that the living word? How does that relate back to me? But when you look at that underneath value and what it's trying to point back to and what we should be taking from it, you can actually see how it is the living word. So
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's saying, you know, it's for you. If you've signed up to live by a value, treat it seriously.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you sign up to honour God with your with all you have, with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, all your strength. That's really what it's saying. It says it in Deuteronomy, actually.
Yeah.
So that's how we should be living.
Yeah.
It's not our job to point our fingers at those who haven't signed up to live by this. See, this is not a law code for the nations around about them.
Yeah.
It's not our right in the church to point a finger at people outside the church and tell them this is how you have to live.
Yeah.
Or we don't stone people to death, but how we stone them to death with our words sometimes.
Absolutely,
You know, we can be pretty cruel,
Yeah,
right?
definitely.
He's not advocating for that. We've got to remember this is actually written to people who are God's people.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't be ever reading these laws and pointing fingers at people outside the church. We should be actually pointing fingers at ourselves and going, where are we not living up to this standard?
Absolutely. And that's reflected in verse 7 of this chapter. At the end, it says, you must purge the evil from among you, not outside of you. So it's an inward thing of yourself and that church community around you.
You got it. It's not our job. Paul says it this way in 1 Corinthians 5. He says, it's not my job to judge those outside the church.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's my job to judge those inside the church. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think you find as well, going back to that heart condition, if you find someone that actually does have the heart condition to become more like Jesus and become more like the morals of God, then that person is willing to be called out on their actions. They're happy for you to actually to be like,
you got it.
Actually, no, you're not doing it the best that you can be.
Yep. We've got a term for that. It's called discipleship.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's exactly. Discipleship is something that we invite, not something that's imposed.
Yeah.
So you've hit the nail on the head. I
absolutely.
mean, a person who's hungry for God should want people around them to say, hey, where am I missing it?
Yeah.
Help me out here.
Yeah.
But it's not my job. Even in the church, as much as I want to care for people, if people don't want to be cared for, I'm not going to force myself to, because it's not kind.
Yeah.
You know, there's a kindness attitude to this. And I think a big part of Jesus is we see kindness.
Yeah. I was going to say you can see it back with Jesus and the disciples as well. You can see when Jesus calls them out and says, where's your heart at? What's going wrong?
They had signed up for that.
Yeah, exactly.
By following him around and being his disciples, they had signed up for that.
Yeah, exactly. And you can see him, I'm sure I can't think of any one specific example, but you can see where he leaves people as well, and is like that person doesn't want.
He does a number of times, but he's not angry. He just goes, "I'm going to invest where I'm wanted." Yeah,
absolutely.
And it's not that he will call people out. He's very quiet in that whole. I think Jesus, you'll often see his attitude as well. If you don't want it, that's okay. I'll go find people who do. Yeah, he wasn't bitter. He wasn't yelling at them. One time there was a rich young ruler, and he said, "What do I need to do to be saved?" Yeah. And he said, He says, "You know the commandments. Yeah. Love the Lord. Love your neighbour as yourself, etc." He goes, "Yeah, I've done all those things." He says, "Well, one thing you need to do, you probably need to sell everything and give it to the poor." Yeah. He says, the young man went away sad because he was very rich. Yeah. And Jesus didn't rebuke him. It actually says Jesus loved him. Yeah. That's why he called him on it. To another person, he wouldn't have had to say, sell everything. But to that man, his idol was his money.
Absolutely. And you can almost see that flipped with the story of Matthew as well, when Jesus says nothing other than
come follow me.
Come follow me. And Matthew's like,
okay. And he does. He drops everything and goes. Yeah.
And you can see that Matthew wanted something
more
and found it and got it and was like, okay, Jesus is telling me this is what I need to do. Let's just
trust it. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So it does have implications for how we disciple, how we speak to others. But I do think it's important that we realise, like you said, this is purging the evil from among you. This is about setting up a new standard for God's people. That would become so beautiful and so attractive that the idea was that the other nations around about would see the way these people were living. Even though it looks antiquated to us, it was so progressive to the other nations that there was something in them that the idea is they'll be so different in the way they treat the women, the way they treat the vulnerable, that there'll be nations around and go, I want what you've got. Yeah. You guys are different. Yeah. And that's attractive.
Yeah. And that's exactly why they're told a few times in these chapters as well not to become like those on the outside. They want the outsiders to become like them as well.
Exactly. And in fact, by the time we get to this, we will have done our Revelation series, but I'm wrestling with it. We're about to start it shortly. But one of the things that Jesus calls the seven churches on in the beginning, and one of the things he calls them on is, I'm wrestling with these words, so it might be different by the time we preach it. You will have heard the sermons by now, but the churches had a choice. They could either dominate the culture, and that wasn't really an issue to them. In the Roman little fleggling house church in Turkey couldn't dominate the Roman culture. Yeah, we can do that now. We can try to dominate culture now. But the main things, they could either isolate from the culture. So I'm working with accommodation, isolation. Yeah. Accommodation, isolation, domination, or transformation are the four I'm working with. And I think that some Christians try to isolate from the culture, pull out completely. Yeah. And that can have a judgmental attitude upon those wicked sinners. Yeah. Domination culture is something we in our world we can have a dominating culture. We're not supposed to. Accommodation is actually our biggest challenge. Yeah. That we become like the culture. Yeah. So you can see that you've got an option there. And I think what God's intention for Israel and for the church has always been is, one, we don't accommodate. We don't become so much like the culture that we can't be recognised as different from the culture. Yeah, absolutely. We're not called to dominate the culture and rule the government and do those sorts of things and force everyone to worship God. We're not called to do that. We're not called to isolate completely from the culture. There is a way we're supposed to be transformational in the culture. We should be engaged in culture and love our culture and be attractive to our culture in such a way that the way we live it transforms other people. Yeah. There are people who want what they see in us. And I think that's the call of Christians, to be transformational. Yeah, definitely. And I think it's interesting. It links to the next section as well, actually. The idea of dominating. In verse 9, it says, Go to the priests and to the judges who is in the office at the time and inquire of them, and they will give you a verdict when they're deciding cases. And the priests coming in to help the judges can almost look like the church is trying to dominate over it as well. Okay, yep. And how does that fit with what you're saying? I just think it's quite interesting that when we're not supposed to be dominating, so from a world perspective now it can look like that versus trying to for the priest to be dominating over the judges, but that's obviously not how it was in that time. You've got to, I think you make a really good point. Here's the thing, is that we need to read the nation of Israel as a theocracy. It was actually a people who were governed as a nation under God.
Yeah.
Okay, so there is space for that to be the case, but that's not the New Testament model.
Yeah.
Many American Christian nationalists actually believe that the church is supposed to be is supposed to rule the state,
Yeah,
and they
okay.
actually, a lot of them believe that, America, one nation under God,
Yeah.
and that somehow that they're supposed to replace Israel. But that's not actually the New Testament view.
Yeah.
Paul never really had a vision for the church getting to a place of domination.
Mm.
And in fact, history has shown us time and time again that when the church, I use that in air quotes, when the church gets to a place of domination in the culture, it usually doesn't handle itself very well. Because with domination comes power.
Yeah.
With power comes corruption.
Yeah.
And actually we end up becoming like the world.
Yeah.
The church has always done its best work on the fringes of society when it can hold to a standard that's still engaged with culture but hold to a standard that's different. So we can't automatically assume that into the 21st century that these, we would say, you don't go to the pastor for a legal ruling, and you shouldn't.
No.
I don't want you coming to me for a legal. I don't have the authority.
Yeah.
That's what the legal system's for.
Yeah.
Go to the law.
Yeah.
Don't come to the pastor if you need to get legal authority.
Yeah.
I might give you some advice, like, maybe you should just let that go. Okay, so they robbed you of $20, but Jesus says turn the other cheek. I might say that. But if it's an area where there's a severe injustice, I would say no. We have a legal system.
Yeah.
If that person has wronged you and robbed you of hundreds of thousands of dollars or has caused you some kind of abuse, then that's what our legal system is for. I would advocate for our legal system.
Definitely.
As flawed as it is, it's still. I can't think of a better one.
Yeah. No.
But in this culture here, we aren't. The church should not be reading that as a dominating culture. We need to see this was a theocracy, which was a people group who had two streams of governance, the king and the Levites, the priests. Both of those streams of governance were actually supposed to hold one another accountable.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was actually the system was set up in such a way that the king would be accountable to the priests and the priests would be accountable to the kings.
Yeah.
It was to try to avoid this whole sense of power imbalance.
Yeah, and that's interesting as well, because power does become that worshipped idol as well.
Yeah,
so
big time.
Trying to avoid that worshipped idol as well. That's quite interesting.
And the only way to do that is through having mutual chains of accountability.
Yeah.
So even in our judicial system, if you get the top, well, I don't think there is a top of the chain, is there? Like, what would happen at the highest level? The high court is the highest level of authority?
The high court is the highest level of court in Australia. Right. But there's not specifically a top person, I guess.
Yeah. So would the Chief Justice of the High Court would be the absolute authority in the Australian court system? Is that how that would work?
That's kind of how it works.
So what are the checks and balances for them? Would if they decided to go into cohorts with each other and rort the system, is there a check and balance in place for them?
Yeah, so it links back into the Constitution.
Okay.
And I think it's the Attorney General. Don't quote me
yeah,
on
no, that's right. I know we're getting philosophical
don't quote
here.
me on any of this. But I think there's things that the government can do, because the government and the Attorney General are the ones that elect those judges into their positions. So they have things that they can do, but we also have 7 High Court judges.
Yes,
so
that's part of that system, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. It's part of that system.
It's not one High Court judge calling the shots. Yeah.
There's 7. So there's always that unbalanced decision. So if, say, 6 are one way and one's the other, there's a level of
accountability.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Yeah, so the point I'm trying to make is that humanity has recognised that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts. Now, no system is perfect, but we are trying to find a system. And ultimately, like you say, it's the government. Well, then who holds the government accountable? Well, the people hold the government accountable, because we live in a democracy where we can vote people out. So there is a process in place. Yeah. And in this time, this process of the priests and the kings was the way that they were held. Yeah. There were two branches of judiciary in the nation of Israel: the king, the royalty, and the Jews, and that's what and the priests, and that's how it's kind of they're holding one another accountable.
Yeah, okay.
It's actually ours is much more advanced. Than this. Yeah, because it's very easy for the king and high priest to get into bed with each other, and they did repeatedly.
Yeah. Did the people of the time have any way to hold the two of them accountable?
Not to the degree.
Yeah, okay.
No.
Yeah.
No, not to the degree. Once again, you've got to measure it against the culture of the time.
Yeah.
In the ancient cultures, the king was the son of God. The king was divine.
Yeah.
You wouldn't do anything against the king.
Yeah, okay.
They had absolute power. Caesar, Pharaoh, they all had absolute power. So it seems antiquated, but it's not antiquated compared to the times around about it. Yeah. But no, I think the only power they would have would be to revolt.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they did from time to time, but I mean that was what happened in the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution.
Yeah.
They basically the people revolted against the abuse of power.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
It's been a problem throughout human history.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because that links directly onto the next part, which is about kings.
Yes, it does. Yeah. Well, let me. I can have a go and see what you think.
Yeah.
So at this stage, they haven't got a king.
Yeah.
Moses is basically saying, when you get in and get settled, God's going to provide you with a king. You don't have one yet. But he's saying when you do get a king, he actually sets some standards. He says this king is not supposed to be like all the other kings who just abuse their power.
Yeah.
This king, in fact, will operate underneath God. This king is to take this Torah and write out a copy of it. When they come to the throne, that's a lot. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
The king is supposed to handwrite the entire Torah.
Yeah.
That's the first third of the Bible. That's a lot of handwriting.
It's a lot.
And they're supposed to keep it beside them on their throne and read it every day.
Wow.
So can you see how that's God saying this king serves you?
Yeah.
This king is not supposed to be like the other kings who rules with an iron fist and abuses their power. This king's under God. And if this king will read and meditate on this Torah, they will be the kind of king who serves you.
Yeah.
You don't serve them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess that I'm just thinking of it in my own head is that linking back to an example of what we should be doing, reading the whole Bible, not just necessarily the Torah, but reading the whole Bible and taking on those traits of God that we should be trying to live up to, and then going out and living them so that we can be a vessel for God.
You got it. And that's why I wanted to do Deuteronomy, because it's, as you've said, I think off air, but you said, a lot of Christians just go, oh, we'll just skip over the law. But Torah is translated law, but it actually means teaching or instruction. So there is actually time to meditate on this, and actually we find God revealed in this. And I take my lead, as I said, from Jesus. I look at how Jesus did it, and I take my lead from there. And I go, okay, there is stuff I can learn about God and about how I can conduct myself in the world in an appropriate way.
Yeah, I think that's all I have for Deuteronomy 7.
All right, let's go to 18.
It's interesting here at the start of chapter 18, it starts talking about the priest. So it's that flow on.
So we've had the kings?
Yeah, we've
now
had the judges, the king, and now we've got the priests. But something that is quite interesting about the first verse that I was kind of a bit confused about why is it says the priests are not to have an allotment or inheritance once they reach the promised land. So is there a significance to that? Why might that be?
Yes. So the priests and the priests were a sub-family of the Levites. So the Levites were one of the 12 tribes, and their primary job was the Levites were the people who facilitated the national worship. Right. So they are the ones who tended to the tabernacle, the church. So put it in our context, I'm a Levite.
Yeah.
People who work in the church are Levites.
Yeah.
And these people, their whole job was to serve God on behalf of the other people. Now, the priests had a very specific role where they would offer sacrifices, but all the Levites did service to God in various different roles. And God says, they are set apart for me. Oh, it just occurred to me why it happens. It's back to the Passover.
Right, okay.
So what God actually says is, when I passed over the firstborn and didn't bring the plague of the firstborn upon you Israelites, you owe me the firstborn child of every one of you actually owe me because I didn't kill the firstborn. You owe me the firstborn of every one of those, of every one of your children. However, basically God says this, I'll make you a deal. I'll swap you the firstborn for all the Levites.
Yeah.
So he actually takes all the Levites as his replacement for the firstborn. And he says, they belong to me. I'm not going to kill them.
Yeah.
They will serve me on your behalf. And so this tribe, they didn't get any land for themselves. In fact, you're going to see they actually had little towns and places they would live within the tribes, but they didn't actually get a whole lot of tribal land for themselves. And so that's what's going on there. They don't get a land, but they worship. They actually serve God on behalf of the people. So when the people paid their tithes to the temple, to the tabernacle in this case, they would pay. They'd come and bring their tithes, and a tithe of that tithe was used for the ministry of the church.
Yeah.
And the other 9/10 of that tithe was actually used to pay for the food and the livelihood of the Levites who weren't able to earn their own income because they were actually ministering to the Lord on behalf of everybody else.
Yeah.
So it's an economic thing.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask about that as well, because this section of the chapter also goes on to say that the priests are to have a certain amount of their grain offering and their meat offerings and things like that as well. But that makes sense that they're not able to work because they're serving
God.
Yeah.
So in my sense, like, you know, as a pastor, I'm paid to do the work on behalf of the church, as our ministers and any staff member in a church is. We're paid to do that, but we're paid by the tithes of the people. So, but I also pay my tithes, just like the priest had to pay a tithe to the church. I still pay a tithe of what I receive as income to the church. But if I wasn't receiving tithes from people in the church, then I'd be off doing something else. So that's the principle it works on.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, you know, in this case, they were paying the people, they were paying the Levites to do the ministry for them. And I would be sitting here today if I wasn't if I had to go and get another job, I wouldn't have time to do this sort of thing. You know, that sort of thing. That's how it works. Yep.
Yeah. The next part kind of goes back to what we were talking about before. Not the people of is like God's chosen people, not going back into the ways of
those
the
worship of foreign gods.
Yeah, and
my title says a call to holy living.
Yeah. And going back to the ways of the other nations and becoming set apart from them.
Well, actually, this passage here almost needs a trigger warning, because this passage here is actually exactly what I was saying about what's wrong with the other nations. It says things like, don't be like them. They sacrifice their sons and daughters as burnt offerings. They abuse people. They use sorcery, engage in witchcraft. Casting spells is all about basically cursing people, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Saying don't be like any of those things. They're detestable to the Lord. And once again, I think the point is it's not that God is what's the word I'm after? Like upset or not upset for himself. He's not jealous in that way. He just says this won't be good for you.
Yeah, definitely. And it takes away our focus from him, which is where it's supposed to be. That's where.
If you live this way, it will bring destruction upon you and your people and your society. Don't live that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's not just going to affect you; it affects everyone around you as well. So,
it's a pretty sobering passage. I mean,
definitely.
Just to read it, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, be very careful not to imitate the detestable customs of the nations living there. For example, never sacrifice your son or daughter as a burnt offering. Do not let your people practice fortune-telling or sorcery or interpret omens or engage in witchcraft or cast spells or function as mediums or psychics or call forth the spirits of the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord. It is because the other nations have done these detestable things that the Lord your God will drive them out ahead of you. But you must be blameless before the Lord your God. The nations you're about to displace consult sorcerers and fortune tellers. The Lord your God forbids you to do such things. This is good instruction because, I've heard Christians go, well, we just smash psychics and all that sort of stuff. That's all true. But what he's telling them is not just the fact that you're consulting psychics or sorcerers. It's that these ancient cultures tried to sacrifice, consult these gods so they can manipulate other people and manipulate the God to do what their billing was. That's the problem. Yeah. It's using other people for our gain, which is back to the Garden of Eden problem.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what he's saying. He's saying you're not going to be like that. You're going to be a people who serve others. Yeah. You don't manipulate others. Yeah. You don't abuse others. You serve them. Yeah. You live for them, not they don't live for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can still see that now, like all of these things are obviously still maybe
continued.
Not the burning sons and daughters as much, but the other things you see those happening in everyday life. And like I know people who have gone to
a psychic or whatever,
psychics or whatever, and they they manipulate you.
Yes.
But then what they've told you lets you go out and manipulate others as well to try and come to what they've said. So
totally. And it's not, go ahead. Keep going.
It's like a vicious cycle of just manipulation, which is so bad for us.
Yeah.
And so bad for not just our spiritual health, but like our own mental health, our physical health, everything. It just pulls you right down.
That's what you said is exactly why it's good. Yeah, it's one on one level we just go, don't go and see a psychic, don't do a tarot board. But I think we often leave it at that level rather than taking what you do is dig down further and go, what's wrong with that?
Yeah.
It's not just that okay, you're opening yourself up to demonic stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what is the enemy? What is the devil wanting to do with it? Well, he's wanting to manipulate you.
Yeah.
He's wanting to create a person who will manipulate others.
Absolutely.
And that's the opposite of loving your neighbour.
Absolutely. And this is a little off topic, but it just sparked a memory of something that I heard, which was so insane to me. So obviously, star signs and personality quizzes and all those kinds of things, they can sometimes fall under these kinds of things, especially like star signs and things like that.
Yeah, I'd say star signs work. Yeah.
Definitely. And
actually, there's some personality quizzes made too. I think some of it's just sociology.
Yeah,
it's just like,
some of it is.
It's just behavioural science.
Yeah.
But yes, sometimes it can become almost takes on a spiritual tone.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's one specific one. I can't remember exactly what it is, but there's a specific one that I heard about. And it's saying that these kinds of things, like especially with the star signs, it says people of, I don't know, cancer have these traits and this trait and that and stuff. And it's saying it's manipulating you into believing that is what you are when you're not. You're
so
actually,
that becomes suggestive.
Yeah. And then, but you're actually created in the image of God. So you saying I'm this trait and this trait based on my star sign is pulling you away from your God-given identity and what you're supposed to be in Him.
I think the way you say that's really good. And that's where it becomes, when a test or something external is informing who we are, that's manipulative and controlling. When we look at a test and go, okay, well, I'm an extrovert.
Yeah.
I'm a certain kind of personality. Even then, it's helpful and it might help me to know how to interact with you. But even still, it doesn't mean I'm somehow completely constricted by that because it's who I am in Christ.
Yeah.
So there should be tools that help us. But when we start to think that external thing is somehow indicative of our behavior or our limitation or excuse, that's just the way I am.
Yeah.
I would go, no, I think we've got to come back to God here. What does God say about us?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. For sure. The next section is kind of separate to that in some sense, but it says that just like God was going to give them a king, God's going to give them a prophet. And it talks a little bit about who that prophet's going to be.
Yes. The Lord will raise up a prophet.
Yeah, and it says the people in this time are kind of saying, how are we going to know who this prophet is when they come, and how are we going to know when who this prophet is?
How are we going to know? How are we going to trust the right one?
How are we going to know? And like, I'm sure most of the listeners have kind of guessed who that that prophet is.
Tell us.
But based on my understanding and of my reading, that's a prophecy pointing to Jesus.
Yes.
So obviously it's something that a lot of people struggle with, whether like especially Jews versus Christians, like how do we know that Jesus is the prophet that was supposed to fulfill this prophecy?
So it's referenced in the New Testament somewhere. I don't know if you have it in front of you, where it's either in Hebrews or Paul. He actually references this. He says Moses said, the Lord. I think it's in the book of Hebrews. Moses said, the Lord God will raise up a prophet.
Yeah.
So he actually references it directly to Jesus. But also too, this prophecy of Moses saying this, it actually led to, it was probably one of the earliest stages of a belief in a Messiah.
Yeah, okay.
That God would raise up one who would speak for God.
Yeah.
This is probably one of the earliest times where they start to shape this up. So as you work your way through the Old Testament, you see the Israelites getting a sense for this Messiah figure, this one who would come. And this is one of the things they would look at this and go, there's still one's coming. We're waiting for him. We haven't seen him yet.
Yeah.
We're still waiting for this one.
Yeah.
Could it be Joshua? No, it's not Joshua. Could it be King David?
Yeah.
No, King David lets us down too. and they're always looking for it. And there's this hope built upon this prophecy, which ultimately finds its fulfillment in Jesus.
Yeah.
I think it's probably just worth adding in there that there, towards the end, it's sort of saying, well, how am I going to know who a prophet is? And this has fulfillment. Like there are prophets in the Old Testament. You know, could it be Elijah or could it be Elisha or any of those, all of those Old Testament prophets? Who could it be? And there's a sense in which they all kind of fulfill, but they all kind of also let down.
Yeah.
They never quite make it to that level. But one of the things he does say is in verse 21, he says, but you may wonder, well, how do we know whether or not this prophecy that someone says is from the Lord? And he says, well, if the prophet speaks in the Lord's name, and his prediction happens, you can take it take it truthfully. So there's a sense in which it's okay to listen to people who are speaking on behalf of God.
Yeah.
But you don't have to automatically swallow everything they say, hook, line, and sinker. There'll be some confirmation of what they say, which will give them a degree of authority.
Yeah. And I guess that kind of also warns us against the idea of false prophets as well, like confirming what someone has said. If they said that they're saying it in the name of God or anything like that, it's also warning against that as well, especially in this time when you think about it as well, when they've got that hope in the promise of a Messiah and of this great prophet that's coming. There would have been a lot of people that would have known that and could have taken that and manipulated it and used it to their own advantage.
Hence why they're asking, Moses is saying, you know, check it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a good warning for us still
and
today.
how it plays out in my life is that I'm not naturally a prophetic kind of person, but over 30 years of ministry, I've kind of tuned in. I can often sense what God's saying, but even then I will be very slow to say, Annaleise, the Lord is saying this to you. Because I don't want to presume. Yeah. Well, actually, to say, Annaleise, the Lord says this to you, if I'm your pastor, I could very easily abuse my power.
Yeah, definitely.
And because Pastor Rohan said it must be true, right? So I want to make sure I stay away from it. I don't want to violate your will. Yeah. So what I might say is, Annaleise, I've been praying about this. You know, I kind of sense this is what the Lord might be saying. I'm not telling you I might be 100% right. I might be off base. Even when I'm pretty confident, I still will be hesitant. Yeah. Because I don't want to violate your free will. Yeah. I'll say, does this make any sense to you? Yeah. And if it doesn't, park it. Yeah. I'll often say, don't worry about it. Maybe it'll make sense later. Yeah. So it's the difference between pointing a finger and saying, thus saith the Lord. Yeah. But also not being afraid to give you some instruction, because maybe you do need some confirmation. Yeah. Maybe you're waiting on something, and me actually stepping out and saying, I'm kind of sensing this, might be the confirmation you need. Yeah. So that's how I walk that. Yeah. I don't want to be this person who declares to speak on behalf of God, but I also don't want to not speak if it's going to add value to you. Yeah, definitely. It's like, I think it was Leonie Schlosser from Picton saying it to me, but she said that, I can't remember where she said she got it from, but it's like this red light, yellow light, green light system. Like I've heard that. You can kind of tell when God's giving you the green go ahead, and you can kind of get when there's the yes wait, but not yet wait. Right. And then there's also like the absolutely do not say anything right now kind of situation as well. And it's like also using your discernment to kind of figure out what situation that falls under as well. As a pastor, it must always be guided by, am I adding value to someone else? Yeah. I should never be speaking on behalf of God to get from others. Yeah. That's actually witchcraft. I was going to say that is exactly what we were just talking about before, because those people are saying, I declare this, I say this, I say and that. You will abide by it. Yeah, I see this, I say that, to get money, to get authority over someone, to manipulate them, anything like that. It's exactly the same kind of situation that God is saying these false prophets will look like that. And why is God so viciously against this stuff that this becomes almost like a capital punishment thing again? Why is it so strong? It's because God has granted every human being the dignity of free will. Yeah. They are created in his image. Yeah. And anytime I use my power to manipulate you, it's one of the most ruthless things. Yeah. It's at the heart of what Eve did when Adam and Eve took from the tree. Yeah. Absolutely. Said, we're going to take what's good for us. Yeah. Absolutely. And usually that's at the expense of someone else. So that's why God's ruthless on this. Yeah. It's not just that it's just a demon. It's actually the demonic forces behind this. This is the heart of what the enemy wants to do. He wants to say, oh, no, it'll be good for you. You can take it. Yeah. Oh, I'll eat it. It'll be good. Yeah. And God's saying, no, you don't live for yourself. You love your neighbor as yourself. Yeah. You do unto others
Yeah.
as you would have them do unto you. That's the upside-down kingdom of
Yeah.
God.
Yeah. Absolutely.
All right, that's chapter 18, is it?
Yes.
Shall we move to 19?
Absolutely.
Oh, cities of refuge.
All right. So in chapter 19, it starts off with this idea of cities of refuge. And it says that when when the Lord your God has destroyed the nations whose land he is giving you, and when he has driven them out and settled in their towns and houses, then set aside for yourself 3 cities in the land of the Lord your God is giving you to possess. What are those cities of refuge?
What are they?
Yeah, like what are they? What's their significance?
Okay, so he'll go on and explain what they are. But basically they were a place, because in that ancient culture, at this stage there's no judicial system for murder or manslaughter. Basically, the standard practice of the nations around was an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. I think that actually comes from one of the ancient law codes.
Yeah.
That was the standard thing, that if someone murdered, you'd murder them back.
Yeah.
Now the problem was, it'll give an example, like what happens if you're out in the bush and an axe head falls off? Was that intentional murder or was that manslaughter? So the idea is that in an instance where there's an accident, there would be the right of reply was that the next of kin of the person who had been killed was actually obligated to seek vengeance.
Yeah.
And so hypothetically, I think it's probably going to say, hypothetically, the axe falls off, it kills their neighbour. Here we go. For example, verse 5, suppose someone goes out in the forest, and this is just an example. This is one example of a case.
Yeah.
Suppose someone goes out into the forest with a neighbour to cut wood. Suppose one of them swings an axe to chop down a tree and the axe head flies off the handle, killing the other person. In such cases, the slayer may flee to one of the cities of refuge to live in safety. If the distance to the nearest city of refuge was too far, then an enraged avenger might be able to chase down and kill that person who caused the death. Then the slayer would die unfairly because they'd never shown any hostility toward the person who died. That is why I'm commanding you to set aside these cities of refuge. So where they are on a map, they were spaced out north, middle and south.
Right, okay.
On both sides of the river, actually. There were 6 cities of refuge in total. There's 3 already given on where they were, and then there's 3 on the other side. The idea was that pretty quickly they could find one of these cities of refuge. And they would go to that city, and they would be able to be protected from the avenger of blood, the relative. And then it would set in place a judicial system where they would then call on the city elders to go, well, let's have a trial. And let's see if we can get to the bottom of whether this happened or not.
Yeah.
Ironically, it also said that they had to actually stay inside that city until the death of the high priest. Once the high priest died, they were free to leave the city, which is kind of weird because I don't think many avengers are going to just take it on face value. Oh, the high priest is dead now. They probably still would have killed them. Yeah. But they would have been violating the law to kill them. So this cities of refuge thing is quite challenging. I can understand at face value why it's a necessary thing. Yeah. And oftentimes these were the Levites who had these towns. Right, okay. Supposedly. It was actually they were Levite towns within the various territories. Maybe because they represented the Lord. I don't know. But it was set up as a place of protection. Yeah. It also looks forward to Jesus, who is our ultimate city of refuge.
I was going to say the same thing, and that's probably, you just said that it was the Levites that had those towns, and that's probably exactly why, because the Levites were there doing God's work, and Jesus did the same thing, did God's work. So those cities of protection are probably...
And Jesus is there's a link here. We won't have time to explore it, but those that want to listen to it, Jesus is our great high priest, it says in Hebrews, and these cities of refuge were in place. You could run to them until the death of the high priest. Yeah. So there's a link there in that the death of our high priest, Jesus, is actually the thing that has set us free from this right to be avenged for our sin. Yeah. So it has an ultimate fulfillment in Jesus, but it also has a practical fulfillment in this
of their
culture.
Problem. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It seems antiquated to us. Yeah. It's not how we would think about manslaughter law, but
no. But I guess it could. Oh, it doesn't really actually. I was going to say I guess it could almost link back to the idea of jail, but it doesn't really because...
Well, there is a sense in which they were being held in that town, but they were able to live with a degree of freedom within that town to prevent... It was just a way of... probably restoring some balance to the concept of the
Yeah.
avenger of blood, because all the
Yeah.
ancient cultures had that sense of,
Yeah.
it was almost like justice had to be served.
Yeah.
And the only way to bring justice is to kill the person who'd killed someone else. And this is just winding that back a little bit. Remember how I said God's trying to show a different standard? He's winding it back a bit and going, hang on a second, there are plenty of instances where tragedy happens in the world and things happen that are accidental. We better show that capital punishment isn't actually always the right way.
Yeah, definitely, especially when there's that eye for an eye concept
Men's
as well.
mindset in the culture. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. The next part talks about witnesses, and it says that a matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses in verse 15. What is the significance of those 2 or 3 witnesses? Why does it need to be 2 or 3? Why can't it just be one person?
So let me ask it differently. How does that fit with modern culture? 2 or 3 witnesses establishing something. How does that fit in a modern legal situation?
Well, it establishes better, but I guess in first instance, it's still one person that, for example, goes to the police or something like that, and then the police link it back. But it's interesting that it has to be 2 or 3 witnesses. Like, it can't be based on other evidence, where in our system there could just be that one person.
There could be one
but there's
person
other
and there's
evidence.
other evidence.
Yeah.
So we would have DNA evidence or video evidence or some other form of evidence. Right? Well, they didn't have any of that.
Yeah.
Okay. So in a culture where the ancient cultures around about it, where one person could have a beef with someone else, they could go to the authority, they could offer the bribe.
Yeah.
They could say, they murdered or they committed a crime. That person, on the testimony of one witness, or even on the testimony of no witnesses, on the whim of the person in power.
Yeah.
So this is another example of God's concession to where they're at, but setting a standard and going, hang on a sec. You start putting people to death and punishing them on the testimony of one witness. How do you know that witness isn't corrupted?
Yeah.
They might just have a beef with them.
Yeah.
So this is like bringing in another standard.
Yeah.
2 or 3 witnesses will be helpful.
Yeah.
To set that standard of justice a little bit higher. Now, it's not enough.
Yeah.
But it was where they were at. In fact, there's a story with Queen Jezebel in the story of Ahab and Jezebel in the story of 2 Kings, where Ahab decides he wants this property, this vineyard that belongs to a bloke called Naboth. And Naboth says, I can't give it to you. He's the king. Ahab's the king.
Yeah.
He goes, I can't give it to you because it's my inheritance. According to the law, it's my family inheritance. And Jezebel, who's always a troublemaker, she says, oh, look, I'll get it for you, Ahab. You stop sulking. I'll get it for you. And she calls the feast in the town and she pays off 2 witnesses to sit opposite Naboth and say, we heard that he has judged both God and the king. And based on those 2 witnesses who she's paid off, they put him to death unjustly. So you can see this still isn't enough.
Yeah.
You think about it, it's easy to, anyone in power could pay off 2 people
absolutely.
pretty easily to testify. So it's not ideal. It's a concession, but it's Torah, it's instruction. It's trying to point us in the right direction.
Yeah. It's interesting because that then links to verse 19 as well, where it says, then do to the false witnesses as that witness intended to do to the other party as well. So the punishment for
false
lying,
witness
is very high as well.
Yeah, and it wouldn't have been in the ancient cultures to the same degree it was here.
Right, okay.
But if you witness testify falsely about someone, God treats that pretty seriously.
Yeah. Yeah, that's quite interesting there as well. And it says, again, the same as it said before in, I think it was chapter 18, I think it was. But it says you must purge the evil from among you.
Yeah.
Again, holding everyone accountable to that same standard as well.
You're supposed to be a different people. You're supposed to look different, behave differently. You're still interacting. The problem was Israel took all these and became elitist, and they isolated themselves. They weren't supposed to. They were still supposed to buy and sell and trade with the nations around them, but live according to a different system that was attractive. Yeah. And you can only do that if they were serious about justice, fairness, mercy, truth, all those things.
Yeah, and that's interesting.
Not bearing false witnesses in the 10 Commandments.
Yeah.
Do not
exactly.
That's how serious it is to God.
Yeah, exactly. And it says that again in verse 21. It says, show no pity, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, and foot for foot as well. It's showing how serious that is.
Yes. Now, they took it very literally.
Yeah.
But once again, it's a concession because Jesus will come along
Yeah.
and he'll say, hey, if someone strikes you on one cheek,
Yeah.
turn the other cheek.
Yeah.
So Jesus is elevating it even higher.
Yeah.
He's not saying eye for eye.
Yeah.
In fact, he catches a woman in the act of adultery. They throw her before Jesus. They say, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone her. What do you say? He goes, well, let's look at it differently.
Yeah.
Who's the one without sin? You
Yeah.
cast the first stone.
Yeah.
So Jesus takes the law, elevates it.
Yeah.
He doesn't. You could argue he was breaking the law by not stoning her.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
But he's not breaking the law. He is appealing to the higher standard
Yeah.
of the law that the
Yeah.
law was intended for in the first place, which was care for them. You
Yeah.
know? Don't get into adulterous relationships because they're not good for you.
Yeah.
He doesn't let her off the hook. He still says, well, no one's condemned you. Now go and stop sinning
Yeah.
for your own good.
Yeah.
Stop living that way.
Yeah. Absolutely. And then that's that calling out each other and
Yeah.
holding each other accountable
Accountable.
to those things as
Yeah.
well. I don't have anything left for that one. Do
Okay.
you?
No, that's it. All right. We'll go to
Wonderful.
chapter
Chapter
20. We're nearly there. Last one.
Well, chapter 20 jumps straight into going to war and some regulations around that. But it's very reassuring to see in that first verse that it says, when you go into war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and an army greater than yours, do not be afraid of them, because the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt will be with you. And you can think back to so many times in the Bible as well when you actually see them go to war and there are so many people ahead of them and God does the miraculous.
Supernatural protection.
Yeah,
victory.
absolutely. Like you can see it. Gideon is always one that
Yep,
comes to
Gideon.
mind for me. Like you can see that God goes ahead of
There
them.
was a supernatural
Yeah.
victory. Yeah. Jehoshaphat. There's a whole lot of them.
There's so many of them. It's so interesting to see that is how this section starts. Like the going to battle part starts with put God before you.
Yeah.
And you will be fine.
So
you
he
don't
says,
have to worry.
So Moses says, when you're ready to go to war, get the priest to come forward.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
It's not what you'd think would be normal. Would it?
No. You'd think that you would want to put the strongest
Your military
person,
commander.
the strongest person out that's got the most authority over everyone. But then you think about it in a sense that the priest does have the most authority over everyone and does have the strength that others might lack because they're the one that is doing God's work
Yes.
as well.
Yeah. So there's an inspiration component. This priest is coming forward and says, listen, all you men of Israel, don't be afraid as you go out to fight your enemy. Don't lose heart or panic or tremble, for the Lord your God is going with you. So they're calling, it's an inspiration speech to trust God.
Yeah, absolutely. And in this kind of sense, it talks about physical war. It's got charities and horses, but you can also apply that to the spiritual war that underlies those things as well.
Yes, because we're not called to go to war against their enemies.
No, exactly.
You know? And once again, this was a concession. This was the culture. We were living in a culture where that's how it happened. People went to war.
Yeah.
But Christ would say, love your enemies.
Yeah.
You know, so he raises it again. But in this culture, God was saying, I'm going to be with you because you're my people.
Yeah, exactly. 100%.
There's some interesting rules in here.
There is.
Has anyone built a house but hasn't dedicated it? Go home. Don't worry about the fight.
Yeah. It's interesting that those are in there. There's 4 actually.
Is there? Yeah.
Yeah, there's 4. So has anyone built a new house and has not yet begun to live in it? Has anyone planted a vineyard and not begun to enjoy it? Has anyone become pledged to a woman and not married her? And is anyone afraid or faint-hearted? All those people get to go home.
they get a free pass.
Yeah, they're free pass, which is so interesting because we don't get a free pass from the spiritual war. So it's interesting.
Okay. Good thought.
It's interesting.
So what's the Torah?
Yeah.
What's the instruction there?
Yeah.
I wonder if the instruction is, you know, it's a way. Basically, it's thinning the herd. It's like a Gideon story.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's very similar. It's like, well, let's just see how much you trust God.
Yeah.
You know, because they get the free pass.
Yeah.
But everyone else still got to stay and fight.
Yeah.
So it's that reminder again that, you know, I've just thinned you out even further.
Yeah.
But I'm fighting for you.
Yeah.
So there's that aspect of it. So in our sense, it's not like we get a free pass from the spiritual fight, but maybe it's instruction to remind us that we might feel like we're completely thinned out,
Yeah.
but God's fighting for us.
Yeah, definitely. And it definitely seems that way when you think of that last of those categories. Is anyone afraid or faint-hearted?
That one makes sense to me.
Yeah,
because you
that
don't
one-
want fearful
no.
people on the battlefield beside
No,
you.
exactly. And that makes sense as well, that God's coming to fill that person. So in the spiritual war now,
Yes.
God's filling that person to make them not fearful
Yeah.
and faint-hearted. But the other ones, it kind of doesn't seem that obvious that anyone who's built a new house can just go home. Anyone who planted a vineyard can just go home. It doesn't seem as, or not to me anyway, it doesn't seem
No.
as obvious.
Well, in that context, let's take it out of our spiritual 21st
Yeah.
century context. In that context, I wonder if God is showing them that, he cares about them so much that he wants them to be able to enjoy a
Yeah.
degree of life.
Yeah.
I want you to be able to enjoy your first year of marriage. I
Yeah.
want you to be able to enjoy your new home.
Yeah.
That's what's most important. I will protect you and your people
Yeah.
and enable you to enjoy it. So that I see that as God offering to carry them.
Yeah. Yeah, that
So
makes
maybe
sense.
that's
yeah.
what it is.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense.
So it's not that we get a free pass from spiritual warfare. And these guys wouldn't have either. I mean,
Yeah.
they've got to go home while their nation's at war or
Yeah.
whatever. It's not a free pass in that sense. So it's not a free pass from the pressure of life. It's not like God was going, I'm going to let you off the hook. You can
Yeah.
have the first 12 months. You're getting married next year. You can have the first 12 months
Yeah.
off from any spiritual battles. It'll be
That'd
easy.
be so nice.
It's so nice. Yeah. It's not necessarily saying that because we know
Yeah.
that's not always the way life
Yeah.
works. But there is a sense in which it's pointing, it's Torah for us to go, he fights our battles.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting as well, going down a little bit further to verse 10, that before attacking, they're to offer peace. And we see that
Oh, yes.
before God took judgment on all of us and made his attack, so to say, in wiping us
Boom.
clean, he sent his peace
So
offering in
good.
Jesus.
I haven't done one of those for a while. That is gold. Say that again. That was so good.
Yeah, so in verse 10
Read what it says and then interpret it for us.
in verse 10 it says, when you march up to attack a city, make its people an offering of peace. And it literally only just hit me then, but it's very interesting that before going to attack, they're coming in peace. And it's like God bringing Jesus to us as that peace offering. We're given that option of peace
Beautiful.
before he decides to judge us and condemn us.
So good. That's brilliant. That's gold. You're starting to read Torah the way you should read it. That's what you're doing. You're
I'm
reading
understanding
below
it.
the surface. It's starting
Yeah.
to tweak. That's good. So, and I'll go even further. So, as well, not even further, because this is probably not as good as what you just said. But what your point was, Jesus is our peace offering.
Yeah.
Before God comes with the heavy
Yeah,
judgment.
absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Offer terms of peace.
Yeah.
I also think it shows us what God is like.
Yeah.
That God isn't the angry, vindictive
No,
God. And he doesn't
exactly.
expect us to be the angry, vindictive God.
Yeah.
We're people who are just always out there demanding our rights or fighting for our freedoms or coming as some kind of instrument of judgment.
Yeah.
Our first offer towards people should be peaceful.
Yeah.
You're blessed are the peacemakers,
Yeah.
Jesus says.
Absolutely.
So that we're not trying to attack the world. We're trying to be offers of peace,
Yeah.
to be different.
Yeah.
That's I reckon that's probably the single most profound thing in the whole episode.
I think so.
That's great, Annaleise. Very good. Jesus offered us peace.
Yeah.
Brilliant. See if you can you got another piece of gold that's as good as that one?
I don't know if I've got another one that's as good as that. I don't think so. But I guess it's just reassuring again in verse 13 when it says, the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, put to the sword all the men. Oh, wait, that's not what I thought it said.
That's not saying
That's
very
not what I
positive.
thought it said.
No, in fact, well, it even says, it says it'll go down in verse 15. I'll say these instructions apply to distant towns, not to the nations around about you.
Yeah.
So you go, well, what's going on here? Why are we to completely annihilate?
Yeah.
There's a few things because it seems like they're saying, God's saying you need to completely obliterate every nation.
Yeah.
First thing I'd say is that the complete obliteration language is a common rhetoric of the time. You often see the king say, we completely annihilated them. We use the term, we won a baseball game. I
Yeah.
completely obliterated the
Yeah.
opposition. We know it doesn't mean that
Yeah.
we killed them.
Yeah.
And it didn't in this culture either. It
Yeah, okay.
meant we would, like Israel saying we want to obliterate Hamas.
Yeah.
Right? Well, maybe they nearly will. They're going to take out a lot of people in the process, sadly.
They are.
But what ultimately would happen is that they might subdue them for a time.
Yeah.
And that's what this language was like. So even when they moved into these cities around about them, they actually didn't completely obliterate
Yeah.
them. Many of them actually did become Israelites and live among them.
Yeah.
So it's a rhetorical language of the
Yeah.
time. However, we've got to remember that this, I think we talked about this in the podcast last year, it does seem hard that God calls these people to take a land and completely annihilate
Yeah.
and defeat and run out of town these people who are living in these areas.
Yeah.
You got to wrestle with that. That
Yeah.
should be confronting to
Yeah.
a Christian
Yeah,
to
definitely.
think that God would do that.
I was actually going to ask that next, because in verses 16 and 17 it says, in the cities of the nation the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave anything alive, anything that breathes, completely destroy them. So it's definitely something that you're like, whoa, that's...
It's challenging.
Yeah.
And so it should be.
Yeah, definitely.
And I'm not going to put a bow around it
Mm.
and say it's perfect. It's not perfect because this culture wasn't perfect.
Yeah.
But it's easy for us to sit in judgment on these people.
Yeah.
Go back 200 years and there were Christian people who thought slavery was an acceptable form
Yeah.
of practice.
Yeah.
It had been for thousands of years.
Yeah.
But it took Christians to come along and go, no, that's not the way God is. And now we all understand that it's not right. So we've got to wind the clock back and realise that this seems to be harsh. But remembering there's two things about it. The first thing I would say is we've just spent a few chapters on and off. We've seen where God is saying how destructive the worship practices of these nations are, that they are doing things like child sacrifice, that they are abusing vulnerable people, that they are trafficking young girls into sex prostitution and in the temples and all that sort of stuff. So it's like it seems hard that God is bringing judgment upon them, but I like this is not perfect, but I like to reconcile that with if it's God hastening what they're doing to themselves, that their own way of life was so destructive that it was going to cause more and more destruction. And it's like God says, okay, if that's the way you're going to go, I'm going to shorten that process so less people are affected. I'm going to change the way. I don't know. I'll be honest, that doesn't totally sit with me either because it's still challenging. But I understand that there is a sense in which God's justice is beyond my understanding.
Yeah, absolutely.
And humans left to our own devices can do pretty bad things.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of almost backed up in a way by verse 18, where it says, otherwise they will teach you to follow all the detestable things they do in worshipping their gods.
There you go.
And you will sin against the Lord your God. So I think that's
so
a good
if you don't
interpretation
deal with
of it as well.
Harshly, you'll become like them.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
And it's not a perfect bow around it, but I think it gives some understanding as to what the Torah is, what's the instruction here. And it is this thing of deal ruthlessly with sin because it's destructive. It hurts people.
Yeah, absolutely. This chapter comes to a conclusion around a very strange topic. Trees.
Okay.
Yeah.
We've just been told to completely obliterate people.
But leave the trees.
But leave the trees.
Don't touch the trees.
What did they do to you, it says?
Yeah. It says, do not destroy its trees by putting an axe to them because you can eat their fruit. So is that the only thing you can eat their fruit? Is that why they're not to destroy the trees but to destroy everything else?
Partly.
Yeah.
Partly. I wonder if, haven't done this, but I wonder if fruit and trees is somehow going to be linking back to the Garden of Eden narrative in some ways.
Yeah.
Like these trees represent a little bit of Eden.
Yeah.
Don't destroy Eden.
Yeah.
These you basically you're destroying, when you go into this land and you're destroying these people and the way they behave, you're rooting out judgment. So you're rooting out the bad stuff.
Yeah.
Leave Eden.
Yeah.
Leave it, because these trees haven't done anything to you. They're your food. It says you can make it. Other trees that don't produce food, it says you can turn them into equipment if you need to. So I think it's more around these trees represent the ideal, because what you're supposed to see when these Israelites cross into and take this promised land is the narrative is written in such a way that they are carving out this bit of land as a new Eden. Yeah. It's supposed to be like a new Eden.
That's what I was going to say. The way I can't remember if it actually references it as New Eden or anything like that.
I don't think it does, but I think it's in the narrative. It's inferred that way.
I have always understood it to be that the promised land was supposed to be like this new Eden.
That's right.
That it was supposed to be a fulfillment of all those kinds of promises that they thought they were getting and everything like that.
Yep.
So
hence why all these laws are in
Yeah.
place to say you got to be different.
Yeah.
You're going to live Eden life.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. I was thinking before you said it might link back to Eden. I was thinking maybe don't touch the trees because the tree is what Jesus was sacrificed on. Like the cross was made out of wood. But I think linking back to Eden is a bit of a clearer picture.
I think it probably is.
Yeah.
There is a prophecy somewhere in the Torah.
Yeah.
There is a word that says that cursed is anyone who is hung on a tree.
Yeah,
Because that was hung on a tree became a type of that
yeah,
thing is quoted in the New Testament
Yeah.
talking about Jesus
Yeah.
being a curse for us. The Apostle Paul says because it is written,
Mm.
cursed is anyone hung on a tree. So there is a sense in that. In fact, the Bible Project did a series going back 5 or 6 years on their podcast series about trees. And I think it's still today they say it's the biggest listened to podcast series they've ever done.
Wow.
It's an exhaustive series, maybe 7 or 8 episodes
wow.
on trees in the Bible and their
Wow.
meaning and their significance.
Yeah.
All the way from the tree of life, tree of
Yeah.
fruit, knowledge of fruit and evil, good and evil, all the way through to the cross and
Yeah.
everything else, and the references to twigs and branches and
Yeah.
trees. It's all deeply
Yeah.
enriched all the way through. So anytime you're reading the Bible and you see references to trees, that's why I went straight to trees, fruit. That's got to be.
Yeah.
There's going to be some Eden stuff.
Yeah,
there.
because when I first read that, I was like, that is the strangest way to
Yeah,
like, the
it's-
strangest way to end this chapter,
It is,
but
isn't it?
to leave off this like rules of war, just
totally.
to leave trees with fruit
Yeah.
on them. It seemed so strange to me when I first read it, but when you link it back to that
To
Eden
Eden.
story, it definitely
Should we close with asking ChatGPT? We haven't done that today.
yes,
Let me
absolutely.
just see what ChatGPT
I was
says.
going to say it's perfect time to end it as well because I've got nothing left to say. Reach the end of the chapter.
So I've just asked ChatGPT, what is the significance of the reference to not chopping down the trees in Deuteronomy 20? Is it related to the Garden of Eden or the cross or something else? It says the reference to not chopping down trees during a siege is primarily an instruction about warfare and the ethical treatment of land during times of conflict. The passage reads, as we've already read it, so I won't read that. It says the directive serves several purposes. Practical wisdom is number one. The command reflects a practical approach to warfare, emphasising the preservation of resources. Fruit trees were valuable sources of food, especially in important times during conflict and scarcity. Destroying them would result in long-term consequences for both the besiegers and the besieged, potentially leading to a famine. That makes sense.
Yeah,
You need food.
Yeah, definitely.
Don't chop down food. Environmental stewardship is number two. It demonstrates an early form of environmental awareness and stewardship, a recognition of the importance of conserving natural resources. Wow, there's something for us in that.
Yeah,
in the whole
absolutely.
environmental
It's-
stewardship
yeah,
thing's a very big deal
definitely.
today. The ethic of care of the environment
Yeah.
is seen throughout the Torah, it says, underscoring the importance of responsible management of the land. Number three is moral conduct in warfare. The instruction showcases a concern for ethical conduct even in the context of war. By limiting the destruction that could be caused, it sets a precedent for a more humane approach to warfare. Yeah, I reckon it's a bit of a stretch because they've just said destroy everybody there.
I think
Yeah.
so too.
Distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants. Okay, in this case, the trees are non-combatants.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, I can see
interesting.
that. So there's an element of there. Which is the whole issue in, I guess, that a lot of people are concerned about with Israel is that
Yeah.
there's non-combatants at the moment, and
Yeah.
that's not. I mean, I'm not totally 100% pro-Palestinian either. I understand that Hamas are hiding themselves among non-combatants, which
Yeah.
isn't a wise thing to do either. It says the instruction is not directly related to the Garden of Eden or the cross, but is more so an illustration of God's commands on how the Israelites are to conduct themselves. I'm going to leave that open. I'm
Interesting.
not sure
Yeah.
that there wouldn't be scholars who wouldn't think there's more
Yeah.
going on. That whole Eden thing we
Yeah.
talked about. I reckon there's partly there. I'm not ChatGPT's not perfect,
Yeah.
but I wouldn't be surprised if that's not in there somewhere.
Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised either, especially just going back to how many links between chapters of
Yes.
the Bible and verses and everything
Yeah.
there actually are. Like,
Yeah, and the ancients did this. So
Yeah.
as we're reading through Torah, we keep questioning it, reviewing it,
yeah.
remembering that we owe them, the writers of the Torah, the readers of the Torah, the dignity of putting ourselves as one of them,
Yeah.
not sitting in judgment upon them
Yeah.
in the 21st century.
Yeah.
Because at the moment we do that, we miss the ability for it to teach
Yeah.
us something.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that'll do us for today.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Annaleise.
Not a problem
Lots
at
of fun.
all.
We're going to get you back in a couple of months for, what are we doing? We're doing
I think we're doing Samuel.
Samuel. We're going to talk about, 2 Samuel. We're going to
Yeah.
talk about King David.
Yes, we
Yeah,
are.
that'll be what we're doing next.
Looking
All right.
forward
Well,
to
thanks
it.
for being with us
No
today.
worries at all.
And
It
we'll
was a
talk to you next time.
pleasure.
See you, everyone.
Bye.